At the start of the 20th century, Europe was convinced the world belonged to it, and that its language, its architecture, its rituals, and its way of thinking were the universal template of civilization. In Paris, London, and Vienna, it was taken for granted that modernity had a nationality, and that it wore a hat, not a turban. This was an era in which the political map of the world was also a mental map. Whoever drew the borders defined what counted as progress. The Middle East, from Constantinople to Beirut and from Cairo to Baghdad, was the stage for Europe's dream of culture and commerce. Railways, telegraphs, and banks connected East and West, but in reality they served the same idea: power through presence. Europeans didn't need cannons to conquer. Contracts, universities, and diplomas were enough. Modernity was sold like a luxury brand, and Enlightenment was treated as a premium service. All you had to do was build a school, open a consulate, and put up an Art Deco hotel, and the new world would start moving into the old cities. French lycées were founded in Beirut, and British gentlemen's clubs in Cairo. In cafes, people read Balzac and Dickens. In libraries, translations of Shakespeare appeared. Arabic-language newspapers began quoting opinion pieces from Le Figaro and The Times. Europe was no longer colonizing only territory. It was colonizing imagination. Its greatest weapon was not ships, but narrative. Cultural colonialism was quiet and effective. It was enough for Middle Eastern elites to start dreaming in French and thinking in English. European concepts of freedom, progress, and rationality sounded like a promise, but carried a hidden condition, recognizing the West as the center of the world. For many young Arabs and Persians, this was a new religion: faith in science, technology, and education as the key to the future. The cities changed their rhythm. Streets that had once smelled of spices and coffee began to smell of soap from Marseille. In architecture, minarets mixed with Art Nouveau balconies. In homes, the Quran shared the shelf with Rousseau and Comte. On stage, Molière was performed in Arabic. Europe created the illusion of partnership in which modernization in practice meant dependence. Modernity carried a passport, and the real frontiers were defined by economic concessions and railway lines. In 1916, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement sketched the future of the Middle East with ruler and ink, as if history were an urban planning project. Two European empires, Britain and France, divided the lands of the Ottoman Empire, turning sovereign regions into protectorates and spheres of influence. In diplomatic language, they spoke of mandates, but in practice, these were laboratories of power, where they tested how long it was possible to rule other people's dreams under the banner of progress. Europe no longer needed colonies full of soldiers because it had mental colonies. Power moved from fortresses into schools, from strongholds into universities, from barracks into libraries. Where the day before people had still been reading poetry in classical Arabic, they were now learning bookkeeping in French. Where pilgrims had once prayed for rain, engineers from London designed canals and dams. Civilization stopped being a metaphor and became an export product. For Europeans, this was an age of self-confidence. For the Middle East, an age of fascination and loss. People lived in a world that was becoming more and more European, but less and less their own. Modernity arrived in a suit but spoke in a foreign tongue. And just as armies had once brought brute force, so now engineers brought change no one quite knew how to stop. 100 years later, the story repeats itself, but with a new actor and a new alphabet. In place of colonial empires, we now have global corporations and development banks. In place of missionaries, consultants, and technology advisors. Europe has lost its monopoly on modernity. Its former role has been taken over by China. It is China that today offers the world a vision of development, stability, and win-win cooperation. Where a century ago schools and churches were built, now factories, ports, and technology campuses rise. Where once French style governed, today Chinese pragmatism dominates. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the same mechanism works in a different form. Credit has replaced the cross, and infrastructure has replaced the civilizing mission. The Middle Kingdom steps in where the West has withdrawn and speaks the language of partnership rather than domination. But the essence of the process remains the same. Whoever builds the roads and ports shapes the direction of history. The Chinese engineer is the new colonizer, not through violence, but through promises. On maps of the world a century ago, red ink marked British and French spheres of influence. Today, that same red marks something else. Chinese investments, ports, railway lines, 5G networks, car factories, and research campuses. Europe taught the world what modernization should look like. China is teaching what efficiency should look like. Europe talked about democracy and the spirit of enlightenment. China talks about stability and mutual benefits. Both models share one belief, that you can dominate the world without war if you control its infrastructure and its language. Once again, the Middle East becomes a mirror of global ambition. Just as it was a laboratory of colonial modernity 100 years ago, so today it is a testing ground for Chinese-style globalization. Then, Europe brought ideas and religion. Today, Beijing brings loans and technology. But the emotion is the same. Admiration mixed with anxiety. Fascination mixed with a sense of loss. Peaceful conquest is not a utopia. It is a strategy. A way to win the world without firing a shot, through contracts, joint projects, and systems of dependency. History has come full circle. A century ago, Europe was the teacher of the East. Today, the East, Chinese and Asian, is teaching Europe that an empire can be built in silence with cables, satellites, and data. Once the symbol of domination was a flag, now it is source code. And perhaps that is the most striking part. A world that claimed it no longer wanted wars has found a way to keep conquering peacefully. Without gunpowder, without blood, but with the same ambition, to ensure that the future has only one center. 100 years ago, that center was London. Today, more and more often, its names are Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Beijing. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Europe smelled of success. London glittered with electricity. Paris bathed in perfume and light. Berlin sounded like a factory of modernity. Vienna like an orchestra of the future. In the air hung the scent of lavender, gunpowder, and printed newsprint. Lavender, because civilization was meant to be fragrant, clean, and elegant. Gunpowder, because maintaining that elegance required force. Newsprint, because the world had to know that an empire of reason had just been born. Europe looked at the map and saw a mirror. Every railway line, every telegraph cable, every steamship was proof that history now had a direction, and that direction was the West. In London, people believed the seas belonged to those who could sail them. In Paris, that French was the natural language of civilization. In Berlin, that technology was the new god. So when ships loaded with tea, cotton, and grain left Alexandria, Bombay, and Canton, they no longer carried just goods. They carried ideas. Steamships exported order, and the letters returning to European ports brought back a sense of mission. Europe felt not only powerful, but necessary to a world it still saw as incomplete. The Middle East appeared as both magical and backward, the cradle of religion and a source of raw materials, but also a region that needed to be enlightened. This was where French missionaries and teachers opened the first lycées, and British officers opened cartography offices. In cities that smelled of coffee and dust, cafes with European tables and bilingual signs appeared. Next to flowing Arabic calligraphy came neat Latin letters. Next to minarets rose clock towers bearing the names of European architects. And just as, a century earlier, territories had been taken by fire, now they were taken by style. Colonialism in its new guise tasted of jam and cognac rather than blood. The traveler, the archaeologist, and the engineer became the new soldiers of empire. In Beirut, photographers captured women in Parisian dresses. In Cairo, people debated women's rights. In Damascus, they translated Rousseau. Europe did not arrive with cannon, but with cameras, printing presses, and fountain pens. It was a conquest that smelled of progress. And though salons talked of humanism, in the background the artillery logic of interest still thundered. Every school was a beachhead of influence, every rail line, a trade corridor, every scientific mission, a prelude to an economic concession. In 1882, the British occupied Egypt, justifying it as the defense of the Suez Canal. In 1911, the Italians moved into Tripolitania, speaking of Libya's modernization. In 1916, the French and British secretly redrew the Middle East, dividing spheres of influence like cards in a deck. Each empire had its own scent. The French, lavender and ink; the British, smoke and tea; the Italians, olive oil and gunpowder. The mixture smelled like modernity, but tasted like dependence. In the corridors of colonial offices, decisions were made that would define future conflicts. In the same rooms where contracts for the railway from Baghdad to Basra were signed, officials discussed how to co-opt local elites into cooperation. It was the economics of a smile and the geopolitics of a teacup. Within a decade, Europe had built in the East a world that looked like itself: modern, aesthetic, hierarchical. But beneath the lavender, the gunpowder smell never quite went away. Every tram in Cairo, every streetlight in Beirut, every newspaper printed in Jerusalem was a reminder that modernity had an owner. Arabs and Persians began to understand that European progress was a double-edged sword. It brought light, but demanded humility. The first questions appeared. Can you be modern without being European? Can you be free while using someone else's words? The empire that smelled of lavender was only half the truth. The other half was gunpowder, discreet, ever-present, necessary to keep the system in place. When uprisings in Egypt, Sudan, and Iraq tried to break free from that net, the response was violence in the name of civilization. Every bomb dropped from a British plane was wrapped in rhetoric of peace and stability. Europe did not want to admit that its order rested on fear. Instead, it spoke of mission. When officers returned to Paris or London, they told stories of bringing education and cleanliness to the world, not discipline and debt. But the economic reports were clearer. Ports, mines, and railways had to pay off, and they did, with interest. This was the first act of globalization, an imperial theater in which the actors played teachers and the students played subjects. In every cup of European tea in Alexandria, there was the hidden cost of lost sovereignty. In every European perfume bottle sold in Beirut, the scent of the illusion that you could belong to a world that did not want you as an equal. The empire that smelled of lavender and gunpowder did not last long, but it cast a long shadow. From its notes and aromas, the contemporary world was mixed, and today it returns in a new edition, in the form of Chinese loans, ports, and campuses. Every age has its own perfume, its slogans, and its empires, and each of them smells wonderful, until you realize that beneath the scent, the gunpowder is still there. In the imperial era, the map was a subtler weapon than the rifle. A line drawn on parchment could change the fate of millions faster than a battalion of infantry. Cartographers working in quiet offices in London, Paris, or St. Petersburg decided who would be a neighbor, who an enemy, and who a bargaining chip. The map was an act of will, not a simple reflection of reality. When officers and diplomats drew borders in the Middle East, they did not see deserts, oases, or tribes. Only their pens saw them, sliding across the paper faster than any caravan could cross a mile. Every stroke had its price. A straight line meant control, a wavy line, compromise, a dot, a garrison, a star, a capital still to be built. When, in 1916, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot signed their secret deal to divide the Ottoman Empire, they believed they were creating a new world order. In reality, they launched a new era of chaos. Their map had no room for differences of language, faith, or tribe. There were only colors, each standing for a sphere of influence. Syria was to be French, Iraq, British, Palestine shared. Arabia was to remain a margin, and the Persian Gulf, a gateway to oil and open sea. Future Turkey was a question mark. Persia, a borderland. Egypt, a starting point for controlling Suez. All this looked tidy and scientific, until ink became reality. until those lines were turned into frontiers cutting across villages, deserts, and sometimes even homes. In that world, the map was proof of civilization. Europeans believed that whoever could draw the world had a right to it. Drawing became an act of rule. The cartographer was no longer just a scholar, he was a politician with a compass. For the colonial powers, the map played the role that algorithms play today, a system that orders reality according to interest. And just as corporations now decide what we see online, empires then decided what could exist on the map. The Middle East was divided like a game board. The British took the Baghdad-Basra line to control oil and waterways. The French took Damascus and Beirut. They needed prestige. The Italians dreamed of Tripoli, the Germans of a railway from Berlin to the Persian Gulf, the Russians of a warm port in Istanbul. Every patch of desert had its strategic meaning, although few of those drawing it had ever set foot there. It was a map of imagination, sketched from ambition rather than geography. When Arabs, Kurds, Persians, and Turks began living within that cartography, the world they knew broke into rectangles. Old regions, networks of cities, caravans, and oases became nation-states. Every strip of sand now had a government, every border had a flag. Only identity could not keep up with the map. Borders created states, but not communities. Each of these countries was born with a wound, a border that cut across memory. The map became not just a tool of power, but a tool of forgetting. Lines on paper replaced oral histories. Cartographers wrote a new version of the world in which Europe was the center and the rest, the margin. Every new territory had its number, its name, its governor, like a file in an archive. The chaos of the desert was transformed into the order of the colonial office. At the same time, the idea of the modern state was taking shape. Bureaucracy became the religion of empires. The census, the map, the stamp, the decree. These were the four sacraments of modernity. Whoever had the map had power. Whoever had power decided who could be a citizen. In this way, a geographic division turned into a socio-economic one. The British officials who drew Iraq's borders had no idea they were planting an explosive device that would last a century. The map was also a tool of illusion. In European salons, the world was drawn in a way that looked logical and predictable. In reality, every state born from a ruler's edge was a ticking time bomb. Iraq bundled together Shia, Sunni, and Kurds. Syria, Christians, Alawites, and Sunnis. Lebanon, Muslims, and Maronites. They now shared a passport, but not a common memory. For the colonizers, this did not matter. They cared about resources and trade routes. Thus was born the first global infrastructure of interests. Instead of swords, contracts. Instead of battles, negotiations. Instead of blood, ink. Instead of walls, borders. It was all written onto maps that were supposed to look objective. In truth, they were declarations of power. For Europeans, cartography was a science. For the rest of the world, a sentence. Today, 100 years later, the map is again a tool of control. Only now it is digital. Satellites, data, trade networks, and transport corridors are the new lines of Sykes and Picot. Where borders were once drawn across desert, they are now drawn in virtual space. Whoever controls data flows controls the world. Back then it was cartographers in uniform. Today, it is engineers in suits. The map is still the same instrument, an elegant form of violence. It always looks neutral, always promises order, but in reality it locks people into boundaries they did not choose. And perhaps that is why modern empires so eagerly draw maps of influence. They know that a world drawn is a world tamed. When Europe realized that conquests were expensive and armies grew old, it invented a new kind of army, teachers. Education became the cheapest form of domination, and the school, a tool for shaping loyalty. Where forts had once been built, high schools now went up. Where garrisons had been stationed, classrooms with portraits of kings and maps of Europe appeared. In the colonial era, the textbook replaced the bayonet and chalk replaced gunpowder. It was enough to teach children a foreign language to make them think in foreign logic. In Lebanon, the first French lycées were established, elegant, with libraries and laboratories where students learned physics, literature, and manners. In Egypt, British schools introduced discipline and administrative structure. In Palestine, missionary institutes blended religion with economics. Each of these institutions was more than a school. It was a factory of worldview meant to produce a new elite, modern, European, grateful. In these corridors, a new generation was born, children who knew the colonizers' language better than their own dialect. Young Arabs and Persians recited Racine and Byron, knew table etiquette, but could no longer write classical Arabic with ease. Their identity became a mosaic in which the original colors faded. Teachers told them they were a bridge between two worlds. In practice, they became people of no world, too Western for the East, too Eastern for the West. This is how the first generation of colonial intellectuals emerged, educated but not sovereign. They believed that progress and freedom would come through knowledge, but did not see that the knowledge had been designed to never fully set them free. Colonial school curricula began history with Greece and ended it in Europe. Muslim science, Arab philosophy, Persian poetry, all were treated as footnotes. Students were taught that modernity had one source and one language. It was no coincidence that, in the same period, Europe was reforming its own education systems. Germany expanded its technical universities and engineering schools. France built its Grandes Écoles. Britain developed a network of colonial colleges. Education became a strategic export. Teachers and textbooks were sent abroad just as soldiers and traders once had been. The school became an embassy of ideas. In these classrooms, smelling of chalk and dust, future officials, doctors, translators, and bankers were molded, the people who would build local versions of the European world. The process was not one-sided. Middle Eastern elites wanted this education. For many families, sending a child to a French lycée in Beirut or an English school in Cairo was a symbol of upward mobility. It opened doors to careers in banking, administration, and the press. Europeans knew that raising a single generation of loyal graduates was enough to secure control over an entire society. There was no need to rule people directly. It was enough to rule their aspirations. Colonial schools had their rituals and hierarchies. The day began with a hymn in a foreign language, followed by prayer, history, grammar, literature, arithmetic, geography. Children learned that the world was ordered, and that at its top stood the nations that had invented progress. In their notebooks, straight lines tamed chaos. Language became an instrument of prestige. Every word written in French or English was a small victory over provinciality. But with the language came a way of seeing. European schools did not just teach how to speak, they taught how to look. In their textbooks, Africa and Asia were the backdrop, Europe, the hero. The West was the center of the story, everything else a footnote. It was a quiet process of cognitive colonization, in which children learned the world the way their teachers wanted it to be seen. They learned to see themselves through foreign eyes. Over time, this education started yielding unexpected fruit. Graduates of colonial schools became leaders of national movements. The same people who wore European suits and quoted Voltaire began to write about the freedom of Egypt, Syria, or Iraq. The paradox was that revolutions against colonialism were waged in the language of the colonizer. Freedom arrived via the grammar of a foreign tongue. Europe discovered that the school was a double-edged tool. It could produce loyalty, but also consciousness. The more people could read and write, the harder it became to maintain the illusion that the empire existed by popular gratitude. Colonial schooling, designed as an instrument of stability, became a seedbed of revolt. Knowledge turned out to be too powerful a commodity to be fully controlled, but the mechanism survived. Modern empires do the same thing, only more elegantly. Today they don't send missionaries, they send scholarship programs. They don't set up colonial schools, they create cultural institutes. They don't translate the Bible, they translate source code and user manuals. In the 21st century, China has understood how powerful education can be as a tool of influence. Its Confucius Institutes operate in over 100 countries, teaching language, calligraphy, history. Officially, they promote culture. In practice, they promote a way of thinking. Just as a teacher from Oxford once explained what democracy meant, today a lecturer from Beijing explains what stability means. In both cases, the goal is the same: to convince the world that development has the face of the benefactor. The school remains the most effective weapon of mass influence. Invisible, elegant, always offered in the tone of concern and care. Because you don't need to conquer people who think like you. You just need to teach them to think in your language.